The great hall of Jarl Bjorn, a chamber built for victory songs and the clamor of clashing tankards, was suffocated by a silence as deep and cold as a winter grave. At its center, upon the high seat carved with wolves and dragons, sat the Jarl himself. His great bearded face, a map of 100 battles, was fixed on a single point across the room. He rose slowly, his sheer size seeming to draw all the remaining air from the space. The firelight flickered across the tense faces of his huskarls in court, every eye following him. The Iron Bear, a man whose voice could shatter shields, looked as if he were about to break. His hands clenched the arms of his throne, the wood groaning under the pressure. His voice, when it came, was not a roar but a tremor of controlled thunder, a sound of profound desperation that shook the very foundations of his authority. "You have all seen my son. You have all witnessed the curse that holds his tongue." He swept a powerful arm across the assembled crowd, his gaze piercing each man and woman. "Healers have failed. Seers have failed. The gods themselves are silent." He paused, letting the weight of his failure settle upon them all. Then came the promise, an oath forged in the fires of a father's last hope. "I swear it on the spirits of my ancestors. The one who can make my son speak will share my throne." The gasp that swept through the hall was a sudden wind, followed by a silence even more profound than before. It was a promise that defied all tradition, a prize so immense it bordered on madness, a seat beside the Iron Bear himself. Power, wealth, and a station second only to the Jarl. Warriors who had dreamed only of a glorious death in battle now saw a different path to immortality. Nobles who had schemed in the shadows for minor influence were suddenly blinded by the possibility of ultimate power. In that moment, Bjorn had not offered a reward. He had lit a torch, and in the hungry eyes of his court he could see the wildfire of ambition begin to spread. At the heart of this storm sat Leif, a small island in a sea of his father's making. The 8-year-old heir was curled on a bench near the hearth, oblivious to the monumental declaration that now pivoted on his silence. He traced the lines in the floorboards with a slender finger, his world reduced to the grain of the wood. His once bright eyes, the same piercing blue as his father's, were now dull and distant, windows to a room no one else could enter. The boisterous hall, with its warriors and whispers, was just a muffled noise from a world that no longer felt real to him. For Leif, the true world was inside, a silent replay of a single, terrible memory. It had been a year since the rival clan had come with the tide, their axes hungry, and their war cries splitting the dawn. Leif had been with his mother in the longhouse, her laughter, a warm melody as she braided his hair. Then the screaming started. The door splintered. He remembered the scent of pine from his mother's hands as she shoved him beneath a pile of furs, the smell of smoke and blood that followed. He saw it all through a small gap in the hides. The flash of steel, the spray of red against the wall, his mother's body falling like a felled birch tree. That was the last sound he had ever truly heard, the last sight he had ever truly seen. Since that day, a fortress of silence had risen around him, its walls impenetrable. He did not speak, he did not cry, he did not laugh. He simply existed. The nights were the worst, filled with terrors that left him drenched in a cold sweat, his throat raw from silent screams that never found a voice. The outside world, once a place of wonder, had become a landscape of threats. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer was the echo of an axe hitting a shield. A raised voice in the hall was the precursor to a death cry. Every shadow held the shape of a raider. His silence wasn't an absence of words. It was a shield against the overwhelming noise of his own fear. Bjorn had watched his son, his only son, the vessel of his entire lineage, drift further away each day. The Iron Bear, a man who could face a shield wall without a flicker of fear, was terrified. He saw his legacy, forged in conquest and held by the respect of his people, turning to dust. What was a Jarl without an heir to carry his name? What was a father who could not soothe the pain of his own child? He felt a crushing impotence, a private defeat more bitter than any wound taken in battle. He would look at Leif's small, still form and feel his own heart turning to stone within his chest, a cold monument to his failure. His desperation had first sought the path of knowledge. He had summoned the wisest healers from 3 long ships away, old women and men with hands stained by a lifetime of working with roots and herbs. They had brewed bitter potions that Leif passively swallowed, and they had burned rare leaves whose smoke was meant to clear the mind. They whispered incantations and applied poultices, their faces grim with concentration, but Leif remained unchanged, a placid vessel for their useless remedies. The boys' silence was a malady their vast knowledge could not diagnose, let alone cure. Each failed attempt chipped away another piece of the Jarl's hope. When herbs and tinctures failed, Bjorn turned to the gods. He brought in seers and mystics, those who claimed to speak with the spirits and read the threads of fate. They performed elaborate rituals under the cold light of the full moon, sacrificing goats and reading their entrails for signs. They chanted in forgotten tongues, their voices rising and falling in hypnotic cadences, trying to coax the boy's trapped spirit from its prison. Leif would simply watch the dancing flames and swirling smoke with the same vacant expression, his silence an absolute force, more powerful than any ritual, stronger than any prayer offered to the indifferent, silent gods above. Finally, Bjorn turned to his own world, the world of warriors. He commanded his most trusted shield brothers, men whose names were sung in sagas, to sit with the boy. They tried to stir the Viking spirit they believed lay dormant within him. They told him grand tales of glorious battles, of slaying sea serpents and discovering new lands. They showed him the heft of a small, blunted axe, and spoke of the honor of dying with a sword in his hand. But their booming voices and heroic sagas were just more noise. Leif simply stared past them, his silence a quiet refutation of their entire world. Watching this last, personal effort fail, Bjorn felt a cold resolve harden in his heart. A new, more dangerous path was opening. From the deepest shadows of the great hall, where the firelight barely reached, Alara watched it all. A thrall, taken in a raid years ago, she was part of the scenery, as unnoticed as the soot-stained stones of the hearth she tended. Her life was a rhythm of quiet servitude, stoking the embers, clearing away discarded bones, fetching ale for men who never saw her face. She moved like a ghost through the loud, masculine world of the Jarl's court, her presence acknowledged only when a task was left undone. This invisibility was her shield, but it was also her vantage point. She saw everything. Alara carried her own scars, not on her skin, but etched deep within her memory. She, too, had watched her village burn. She, too, had seen her family cut down by the cold, indifferent steel of raiders, not unlike the very men she now served. She understood the fortress of silence because she had lived within its walls for a time. The quiet was a sanctuary, a place where the screams could finally stop. In Leif, she did not see a mute prince or a broken heir. She saw a reflection of the terrified, shattered child she had once been, a small soul lost in the echoing aftermath of horror. She observed the clumsy, prideful attempts to fix the boy with a quiet, aching pity. She watched the warriors try to frighten a word out of him, their frustration turning to anger. She saw the noblewomen, draped in fine silks, try to purchase a sound with honeyed cakes and carved toys, their compassion a shallow performance for the Jarl. They all saw the boy as a puzzle to be solved, a lock to which they needed the key. They did not see the wound itself, raw and festering beneath the silence. They were all speaking at him, demanding from him, but no one was simply sitting with him in his quiet darkness. A fierce war raged within her. Compassion urged her to act, to try to reach the boy in a way no one else had. But fear held her back, a cold hand gripping her heart. She was a thrall, a piece of property. Her life was forfeit to the whims of her master. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and she could be whipped or worse. To approach the Jarl's son without being commanded was an act of profound arrogance, an unforgivable breach of her station. And yet, every time she looked at Leif's lonely, small form, the sight chipped away at her resolve, wearing down her fear with the constant, gentle pressure of empathy. The day after the Jarl's proclamation, the great hall transformed into a stage for a grim and desperate theater. The first to try his luck was a hulking berserker named Gorm, a man who believed any problem could be solved with brute force. Convinced the boy simply needed a proper fright to shock his voice back into action, he crept up behind Leif and let out a deafening battle roar, clanging his axe against his shield. The sound echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. Leif didn't scream, he didn't even flinch. He simply curled into himself, making his small body even smaller, his shield of silence growing thicker. Next came a noblewoman, Lady Astrid, renowned for her cunning and ambition. She approached not with threats, but with treasures. She laid out a blanket of soft velvet and covered it with glistening gifts, a finely crafted wooden horse with a real horsehair tail, a dagger with a polished silver hilt, and candied fruits imported from southern lands at great expense. She cooed at Leif, her voice dripping with false sweetness, urging him to just say thank you or horse. Leif glanced at the glittering pile with complete disinterest before turning his gaze back to the empty hearth. The lavish bribe as meaningless to him as a pile of rocks. Following the failed attempts at fear and avarice, an old skald, his beard white as snow, tried to lure the boy out with the power of words. He sat before Leif and began to weave a grand epic, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the story. He sang of Odin's quest for wisdom, of Thor's battles with giants, of ships sailing into the sunset in search of glory. The tale was magnificent, holding the rest of the court captive. But the words, so full of power and meaning for everyone else, simply washed over Leif, unable to penetrate the deep, still waters of his private world. The boy remained unmoved, a silent testament to the failure of even the greatest stories. From his throne, Bjorn watched each attempt, and with each failure a piece of him seemed to die. The hope that had ignited with his promise was now dwindling to a cold ember. The calculating looks from his court were beginning to feel less like ambition, and more like vultures circling. He had staked his authority, his very throne, on this impossible task, and the futility of it all was beginning to crush him. The Iron Bear, the man who had bent kingdoms to his will, sat slumped in his great chair, a prisoner in his own hall, held captive by the silence of his 8-year-old son. Elara watched from her corner, her heart aching for the boy. These people, in their greed and their ignorance, were not trying to heal him. They were trying to break him open like a locked chest to get to the treasure inside. They used fear, bribery, and noise, the very things that had driven him into silence in the first place. They saw a problem, to be solved for their own gain, not a child drowning in pain. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now being overshadowed by a rising tide of protective anger. Someone had to show him he wasn't alone. As the sun began to set, casting long, weary shadows across the hall, the last of the day's hopefuls admitted defeat. The nobles and warriors retreated to their tables, their whispers filled with frustration and scorn for the silent, unyielding boy. Leif was left alone again, a small figure by a tall, narrow window, watching the first snowflakes of the evening begin to fall. From the shadows near the hearth, Elara clutched a small object in her hand, its rough, wooden texture, a small comfort. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her decision was made. She took a single, deep breath and took one hesitant step out into the fading light. She stepped from the gloom of the back wall, her soft leather shoes making no sound on the stone flags. The great hall, moments before a theater of failed ambition, was now a hollow, echoing space, settling into the quiet of the evening. To the few remaining huskarls nursing their ale, she was just a thrall moving to clear the tables, a shadow performing its nightly duties. But Elara wasn't looking at the tables. Her gaze was fixed on the small silhouette of the prince by the window, a lonely island in a sea of cold stone. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, each beat a choice between the safety of her servitude and the dangerous pull of a shared sorrow. She clutched the wooden bird in her pocket, its familiar shape her only courage. Jarl Bjorn, slumped in his high seat, watched her emergence from beneath heavy lids. He was a mountain of a man reduced to rubble by a child's silence. He saw the thrall, a girl whose name he barely knew, begin the long walk across the hall, not towards the discarded plates, but towards his son. A flicker of irritation arose, the last ember of his authority. Who was she to approach the heir? But the anger died as quickly as it came, replaced by a profound weariness. Let her try. Let the fool have her moment. What more could fail tonight? He had watched warriors and nobles fail. What harm could come from the pathetic attempt of a slave girl? He remained still, a silent, brooding observer of this final, desperate act. The journey across the hall felt 1,000 paces long. With every step, Elara felt the weight of unseen eyes, the judgment of the warriors, the cold indifference of the stone walls that had witnessed so much power and so little kindness. She could feel the Jarl's gaze on her back, a physical pressure that urged her to turn and retreat into the shadows where she belonged. But then she looked at Leif, at the slump of his small shoulders, and the fear receded. He was not a prince to her, not the key to a throne. He was a memory of herself, a small boat lost in the same storm she had barely survived. She focused on him, letting the rest of the world and its dangers fall away. She did not stop in front of him, a looming adult demanding attention. Instead, she came to his side and gracefully lowered herself to sit on the stone floor a few feet away, making herself smaller, less threatening. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a toy or a honeyed word. She simply shared his space, his silence, his view of the gently falling snow. The quiet that settled between them was different from the tense, expectant silence that had suffocated the hall all day. This was a shared quiet, a stillness that offered sanctuary rather than demanding a response. For the first time in a long time, someone was not trying to break into Leaf's world, but simply sitting on its shore with him. For a long moment, Leaf gave no sign he had noticed her. He remained transfixed by the swirling patterns of the snowflakes against the darkening sky. He was accustomed to being an object, a puzzle that others tried to solve with loud noises and shiny things. This quiet presence was new. It did not intrude. It did not demand. Slowly, cautiously, as if expecting a trick, he shifted his gaze from the window and let it slide sideways. He saw the thrall, her head slightly bowed, her hands resting in her lap. She wasn't looking at him, but at the same snowflakes he was, as if she too found a strange comfort in their silent, steady descent from the heavens. With a slow, deliberate movement, Alara reached into the small pouch tied at her waist, her fingers closed around the worn, smooth wood of the bird. She drew it out and held it in the cup of her hands, letting the low firelight catch on its simple form. It was nothing like the polished, perfect toys Lady Astrid had offered. This was a crude thing, its wings uneven, its shape born more from love than from skill. It was a fragment of a forgotten life, a tangible piece of a memory. She didn't offer it to Leaf. She just held it, warming the cold wood with her own hands, as if reawakening the spirit of the man who had carved it for her so long ago. Then she spoke. Her voice was not for the Jarl or his court, but for the space between her and the boy, a sound as soft as the rustle of dry leaves. "My father made this for me," she began, her eyes still on the bird in her hands. "He was not a great carver. He was a fisherman, and his hands were rough from the nets in the cold sea. But he made this." She paused, tracing one of the bird's wings with her thumb. "He said it was a seagull. He told me that as long as I had it, I would always have a piece of home to carry with me, no matter how far the tide took me." Leaf's head turned a fraction more. The story was not a command. It was not a question. It was just a memory offered freely into the quiet air. The soft, sorrowful tone of her voice was a stark contrast to the booming epics of the skald or the cloying sweetness of the noblewomen. This was a real story, one that felt heavy with truth. He watched her thumb move back and forth across the wooden wing, his eyes drawn to the simple, repetitive motion. He saw the way the firelight caught the grain of the wood, illuminating the nicks and marks left by a fisherman's knife. The world outside the window, the falling snow, began to fade from his awareness. From his vantage point, Bjorn leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on his knees. This was not what he had expected. There was no trickery, no magic, no loud spectacle. It was just a girl and a story. Yet he saw his son, who had been an unmoving statue for weeks, turn his head. He saw Leaf's focus shift from the window to the thrall. It was the slightest of movements, a change so small that anyone else might have missed it. But for Bjorn, who had been starving for any sign of his son's return, it was like the first crack of a thawing river in the dead of winter. A fragile, dangerous hope began to stir in his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. Alara's voice remained a low murmur, weaving her past into the present moment. "The day the raiders came, the sky was gray," she said, her gaze becoming distant, looking through the walls of the hall and back in time. "I remember the smell of salt and smoke mixing in the air." She didn't look at Leaf, didn't want him to see the pain in her eyes and feel pressured by it. She was creating a space where their shared, unspoken trauma could exist without fear. "My father hid me under the fishing nets. He told me to be as quiet as a stone at the bottom of the sea." As she spoke, Leaf's hand, which had been lying limp at his side, clenched into a small, tight fist. She continued her story, her words painting a picture of a world shattered by violence, a narrative Leif knew intimately. She spoke of the screams, not as a terrifying memory, but as a distant sound, like the cries of gulls in a storm. She described a feeling of being small and helpless, of wishing she could shrink into nothingness until the danger passed. After, she said, her voice dropping even lower, after, the world was too loud. Every dropped pot sounded like a sword hitting a shield. Every shout was a war cry. Silence was the only safe place. It was like pulling a thick fur blanket over my head. No one could get in. Nothing could hurt me there. For the first time, Leif turned his entire body to face her. Her words were not just a story. They were his story. She was speaking the language of his fear, giving voice to the silent terror that had held him captive for a year. He looked at her face, truly seeing her now. He saw the old sorrow in her eyes, the lines of a pain that had not fully healed. In her, he saw not a thrall or a stranger, but a fellow survivor. He was not the only one. He was not alone in the quiet fortress he had built. Someone else had lived there too. Someone else understood the safety of its walls. The few Huskarls, still lingering by the fire, exchanged bemused looks. What was this? The girl was whispering sad tales to the mute prince. It was a pathetic sight. One of them let out a short, derisive snort, earning him a sharp elbow from his companion. They could not comprehend the delicate exchange happening across the hall. To their warrior sensibilities, this quiet sharing of weakness was the opposite of a cure. They saw no strength in it, no power. They saw only the foolish, gentle ramblings of a slave girl, and they turned back to their ale, dismissing the scene as the final, pitiful failure of a long and frustrating day. Elara felt the weight of their scorn, but it didn't matter. Her world had shrunk to this small space, to the boy whose eyes were now locked on hers. For a long time, she confided, I didn't speak, not because I couldn't, but because words felt useless. They were too small to hold what I had seen. They felt like lies. She looked down at the bird in her hands again. It was easier to be quiet. It was easier to just be, and to remember. She was giving him permission for his silence, validating it not as a curse or a sickness, but as a natural, necessary shield against a world that had become unbearable. Bjorn stood now, having risen from his throne without realizing it. He moved like a hunter, stalking the edges of the firelight, his eyes fixed on his son and the thrall. He saw the connection between them, a fragile thread woven from whispered words and shared pain. He saw Leif's posture change, the boy's body uncurling from its defensive crouch. He saw an awareness in his son's eyes that he hadn't seen since before the raid. This slave girl, with her sad story and her crude toy, was accomplishing more in these few moments than all the healers, seers, and warriors combined. He held his breath, a giant of a man frozen by a power he could not comprehend. Gently, Elara placed the wooden bird on the stone floor in the space between them. It was not a gift to be accepted or rejected. It was an anchor point, a piece of her story now resting in his world. My father is gone, she said, the words simple and clean, stripped of any plea for pity. The men who took me, they are the men who live in this hall. She said it without bitterness, as a plain fact. But he gave me this bird. He told me it would remind me that even after the worst storm, the gulls always return to the sky. She had offered him her entire history, her greatest loss, and her one remaining piece of hope. Leif stared at the small wooden bird resting on the cold stone. It seemed so small and vulnerable in the vastness of the great hall. It was a symbol of a father's love, a love that had been stolen away by violence, just like his mother's love. He looked from the bird to Elara's face, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of his own grief. He saw the truth of her words, the shared landscape of their sorrow. His world, which had been a solitary prison of looping, terrifying images, suddenly had a small window, a window that looked out onto another person who understood the view. After laying her story bare, Elara fell silent. She had done all she could. She had built a bridge of words and memory, and now she could only wait to see if he would cross it. She did not prompt him. She did not lean closer with hopeful expectation. She simply sat, her hands resting in her lap, her posture one of patient stillness. She gave him back the silence, but this time it was not an empty void. It was a space filled with shared understanding, a quiet place where he could choose his next move, without pressure or fear. The entire hall seemed to be holding its breath with her, waiting. Slowly, as if his arm weighed more than he could bear, Leaf reached out. His small hand, pale and thin, trembled in the air. The movement was hesitant, fraught with the weight of a year of stillness. For so long, his hands had only been used to clutch his blankets during night terrors, or to trace meaningless patterns on the floor. Now, he was reaching for something. He was reaching towards another person's pain, towards the bridge he had offered him. Bjorn took a half step out of the shadows, his self-control shattering, his entire being focused on that small, trembling hand. Leaf's fingers, shaking almost uncontrollably, brushed against the carved wooden wing of the bird. He did not grasp it. He just made contact. The rough texture of the wood, a startling, real sensation. His eyes, which had been fixed on the toy, lifted to meet Elara's. And for the first time since the raid, the windows to his soul were not empty. A flicker of light, of conscious thought, of connection, shone from their blue depths. He was there. He was present. Then, his lips, pale and chapped from disuse, parted. They formed a shape, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, as if trying to remember a long-forgotten language. The moment stretched, thin and taut, threatening to snap. Bjorn stood frozen in the shadows, his heart a wild thing hammering against his ribs, convinced his own thunderous pulse would shatter the delicate spell. He willed himself to be invisible, to be nothing more than a statue of anxious stone. Every instinct screamed at him to rush forward, to sweep his son into his arms, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the slightest movement, the slightest sound from him, would send Leaf retreating back into the impenetrable fortress of his silence. He could only watch, a powerless king witnessing a miracle or a final crushing defeat. Elara saw the boy's struggle, the immense effort it took to form a sound. She offered him a small, sad smile, a gesture of pure empathy that asked for nothing in return. It was a smile that said, "I know it hurts. I know it is hard. Take your time. I am not going anywhere." There was no pity in her expression, only a profound and quiet understanding that flowed between them, strengthening the fragile thread of their connection. She was his anchor in this terrifying sea of memory, her calm presence giving him the courage to navigate the treacherous currents and attempt to find his voice. Finally, his small fingers closed around the wooden bird. He lifted it from the floor, its weight almost nothing, yet it felt as heavy as the world. He held it in his palm, the wood a warm, solid presence against his skin. It was real. This moment was real. The memories the bird summoned were of his mother, of her hands braiding his hair, her laughter echoing in the longhouse just before the screaming began. But now, filtered through the lens of Elara's story, the pain was not a solitary burden. It was a shared grief, and in that sharing, it became, for the first time, bearable. He looked at the bird, then back at Elara, his eyes wide with a dawning comprehension. He was connecting the dots of their separate tragedies, seeing the universal shape of loss. He saw his mother in her father. He saw his own silence in her retreat from the world. A single, hot tear broke free and traced a path down his cheek, a clean line through a year's worth of settled dust and sorrow. He opened his mouth again, and a sound came out, a dry, rasping noise, the sound of a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for an eternity. The huskarls by the fire heard the noise this time. It was faint, but unmistakable. They stopped their quiet conversation, their heads snapping towards the boy and the thrall. Their eyes widened in disbelief. They looked at each other, then at the Jarl, who stood like a stone sentinel in the shadows, his face an unreadable mask of tension. The air in the great hall grew thick and heavy, charged with a sudden, impossible energy. The quiet of the evening was no longer empty. It was filled with the electric anticipation of a breaking storm. Something was happening. The curse, the silence, was cracking. Elara did not react with a gasp or a sudden movement. She remained perfectly still, a calm center in the growing storm of expectation. Her patience was a gift, a silent promise, that she would not rush him or celebrate prematurely. She knew this journey back to the world of words was a perilous one, and the first step was the most treacherous. Her unwavering calm communicated to Leif that he was safe, that this space she had created with him was secure, and that he could proceed without fear of judgment or the overwhelming pressure of his father's desperate hope. He could find his own way. He drew a shaky, shuddering breath, the effort immense. His small chest rose and fell. His gaze was turned inward now, focused on a memory he had replayed 1,000 times in his silent world. It was the image of his mother, her hand outstretched, her mouth forming a word as the raider's axe rose. He was not just trying to speak. He was trying to finish a conversation that had been brutally interrupted. He was trying to answer her. The muscles in his throat worked, straining against the atrophy of long disuse. The word finally came, not a shout, but a whisper. It was as fragile as a snowflake, as cracked as old ice, yet it cut through the silence of the great hall with the force of a thunderclap. Mother! The word was not directed at anyone present. It was an echo from the past, a ghost of a sound released into the present. A single word, carrying the entire weight of his grief, his terror, and his loss. It was the first brick he had laid on his long, arduous path back from the silent darkness. The whispered syllable traveled across the stone floor and struck Jarl with the force of a physical blow. He staggered, his hand flying to his chest as if to stop his heart from bursting. Relief, so powerful it buckled his knees, washed over him, followed by a wave of gut-wrenching grief for his lost wife. His son had spoken. The curse was broken. But as the initial shock subsided, a new, more complicated emotion began to surface. The first word from his son's lips, the key to his entire legacy, was not for him. It was a name, a memory, brought forth by the shared sorrow of a nameless thrall. The silence that followed the boy's whispered word was a new kind of quiet, heavier and more dangerous than before. It was the silence of a held breath, of a drawn bowstring. The Huskarls stared, their mouths agape. Jarl took a lumbering step forward, then another, his face a maelstrom of warring emotions, relief so profound it looked like pain, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible understanding. He had offered his throne for a word, and a slave girl had bought it with a simple story. His gaze fell upon Alara, no longer seeing a piece of property, but a wielder of some strange, incomprehensible power. He had lit a wildfire of ambition, and this girl, this nothing, was now standing in the heart of the flames. Leif, seemingly unaware of the seismic shift his single word had caused, clutched the small wooden bird in one hand, and, with the other, took hold of the rough-spun fabric of Alara's tunic. It was an anchor in a suddenly tumultuous sea. He looked up at his father, the towering figure of the Iron Bear, and for the first time there was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet questioning. He did not shrink away. Bjorn stopped a few paces away, his instincts warring with each other. He wanted to rush forward, to crush his son in an embrace, but he saw the boy's grip on the thrall. He knew with a chilling certainty that the fragile bridge back to his son did not lead to him, but to her. The whispers began then, insidious as smoke seeping through floorboards. Lady Astrid's face, moments before a mask of feigned sympathy, was now a portrait of venomous fury. Gorm the berserker gripped the hilt of his axe, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on Alara with a look of murderous disbelief. A thrall? A foreign slave would sit on a throne carved for Viking kings? The promise had been a challenge to their strength, their cunning, their wealth. It was meant to be won by a warrior or a noble. This outcome was not just a failure, it was a humiliation, an inversion of the natural order of things. It was an insult to their very identity. Bjorn saw it all. He saw the daggers in their eyes, the tightening of their jaws. His oath, sworn in a father's desperation, had become a political catastrophe. He raised a hand, not in triumph, but to quell the rising tide of dissent. "The hall is cleared," he commanded, his voice rough with an emotion no one could quite name. "Leave us." The order was met with a moment of defiant hesitation before the Huskarls and nobles slowly, reluctantly, began to file out, their backward glances at Alara filled with a mixture of awe and naked hatred. The great hall, once a place of community, now felt like a battlefield where the lines were being drawn, and Ilara was standing alone on the most dangerous ground. As the heavy oak doors boomed shut, leaving only Bjorn, Leif, Ilara, and a few trusted guards, the Jarl finally knelt. It was a gesture so alien to him that his body seemed to protest, his knees cracking in the silence. He was now on eye level with his son. "Leif," he said, his voice a raw plea. "Say it again." He was a king begging for an affirmation, a father desperate to believe the miracle was real. Leif looked from his father's desperate face to Ilara's calm one. He clutched her tunic tighter, took a small breath, and looked back at the Jarl. He did not repeat the word. He simply shook his head, a small, definite gesture that spoke volumes. The voice was his, but the key, it seemed, belonged to another. Bjorn rose, a mountain of a man cloaked in a new kind of defeat. He had his son back, but he had also lost him in a way he had never imagined. He turned to Ilara, and his voice was cold, heavy with the burden of his impossible promise. "You will be taken to the West Chamber. You will be given food and fine clothes. You will be guarded." It was not a reward. It was a sentence. He was placing her in a gilded cage, both to protect her and to contain the political storm she represented. He was no longer just a father. He was a Jarl again, and he was beginning to see the impossible, bloody math of the choice that lay before him. An oath sworn on his ancestors versus the stability of his entire domain. Ilara was led away by two towering huskarls, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was no longer a ghost in the halls. She was a spectacle, a problem. She glanced back once to see Leif watching her go, his small face etched with the first signs of a new panic. They were separating him from his only anchor. As she was escorted down a stone corridor she had only ever scrubbed, she realized the terrifying truth of her situation. She had not won a throne. She had become the most valuable and the most vulnerable piece in a game she didn't know how to play, a game where the prize for the other players was her life. In the solitude of the West Chamber, a room finer than any she had ever imagined, fear began to set in. The wool blankets were soft, the fire was warm, but the silence was menacing. The guards outside her door were not there for her comfort. She was a prisoner of the Jarl's promise. She thought of Leif, of the terror in his eyes as they led her away. Had she made things worse for him? Had her attempt to soothe his pain only trapped him in the center of a new, more dangerous conflict? She walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard, where warriors were gathered in tense, angry knots. They were all looking up at her window, their faces grim in the torchlight. Bjorn sat alone on his throne in the empty hall, the fire casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping specters. He was trapped. To honor his oath was to invite rebellion. The nobles would never accept a thrall as their equal. His warriors, men who followed him for his strength, would see it as madness. But to break his oath? That would make him a liar, a man whose word was worthless. More than that, he feared it would slam the door on his son's recovery, perhaps forever. He had staked his kingdom on a child's voice, and now he stood to lose both the kingdom and the child. He felt the cold iron arms of the throne, not as a symbol of power, but as the bars of his own cage. The next morning, the tension in the keep was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating like smoke from a damp fire. Warriors sharpened their axes with unnecessary vigor, their scraping blades setting everyone's teeth on edge. Lady Astrid, her face a mask of cold fury, met with a council of elder nobles in a secluded alcove, their whispered conversation a venomous hiss. They spoke of tradition, of bloodlines, of the shame Bjorn was about to bring upon his house. An oath made in grief was no oath at all, she argued. It was a symptom of a sickness, a weakness in their Jarl that needed to be cut out before it infected them all. A plot was beginning to coalesce, its sole purpose the removal of the thrall. Ilara was brought a meal on a silver tray, a feast of smoked fish, fresh bread and cheese. It was more food than she had seen in a month, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. She was a lamb being fattened for some unknown purpose. Later, a noblewoman she didn't know arrived with a gift from the Jarl, a gown of deep blue wool, finely embroidered at the collar and cuffs. It was a queen's garment. As Ilara held it, she felt its weight, the impossible burden it represented. It was a costume for a role she could never play, a beautiful shroud for the girl she used to be. Every kindness felt like a threat, a tightening of the net around her. Leif, confined to his own chambers, refused to eat. He sat by his window, which overlooked a different part of the keep, and stared at the empty sky. His father came to see him, bringing a carved wooden wolf, a toy he had once loved. Leif did not even look at it. The brief light that Alara had kindled in his eyes was dimming, a fading ember in a growing darkness. He had taken one step out of his silent fortress, only to find the world outside was just as frightening, but in a new way. He had found a single, safe hand to hold, and it had been pulled away from him. The silence was creeping back in, a familiar, cold blanket. Bjorn saw the regression in his son and felt a cold dread snake around his heart. He had tried to control the situation, to isolate the problem, but in doing so, he was poisoning the cure. His attempts to manage the political fallout were destroying the very miracle he sought to protect. He was a warrior, used to clear objectives and direct action. He could fight a shield wall, raid a coastline. But this? This was a knot of honor, politics, and love, and every thread he pulled seemed to make it tighter. The weight of his crown had never felt so heavy, so much like a millstone, dragging him down into a dark, cold sea. That evening, the noblewoman returned to Alara's chamber. "The Jarl wishes to see you," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. As Alara followed her, she saw the looks from the guards in the hall. They no longer saw an invisible thrall. They saw a contender, a witch, a threat. The walk to the great hall was a gauntlet of silent judgment. When she entered, she saw the Jarl was not alone. His inner circle was there, Gorm, Lady Astrid, and a half-dozen of his most powerful lords and chieftains. They stood like a panel of executioners, their faces carved from stone. Leif was not there. This was not about him. This was about her. Bjorn sat on his high seat, his face grim. He did not ask her to sit. He let her stand in the middle of the floor, a small, solitary figure in the vast, intimidating space. "My promise was heard by all," he began, his voice echoing in the tense hall. "An oath sworn on the ancestors cannot be unsworn." A flicker of hope ignited in Alara, quickly followed by a wave of terror. What was he about to do? Lady Astrid's eyes narrowed to slits. "But a Jarl's first duty," Bjorn continued, his gaze sweeping over his furious court, "is to the strength and stability of his people. To place a thrall on the high seat would break this hall in two." He was trying to find a path between two impossibilities. Alara could feel the hatred from the assembled nobles boring into her. They wanted him to renounce the oath, to cast her out, to restore the order they understood. Bjorn looked down at her, and for a moment she saw not a Jarl, but a desperate father. "My son spoke to you. He trusts you. That is a power I cannot ignore, nor can I reward it with a crown it would crush." He was wrestling with the words, trying to forge a new reality out of the wreckage of his rash promise. He was disarming her, stripping her of the prize, but he was not casting her aside. Then came the new proclamation, a compromise forged in desperation. "You will not share my throne," Bjorn declared, and a collective sigh of relief went through the assembled nobles. "But you will be given a station of your own. From this day forward, you are no longer a thrall. You are Alara, the keeper of the Heir's voice." The title was unheard of, a strange and awkward construction. He was giving her status, protecting her under his authority, and tying her fate directly to his son. "You will be responsible for my son's well-being. You will have chambers next to his. Your word on matters concerning him will be second only to my own." The nobles stared, momentarily stunned into silence by the audacity of the move. He had not given her the throne, but he had given her something almost as dangerous, proximity to power. He had made her the gatekeeper to the heir. Lady Astrid's face, which had relaxed in triumph, now tightened again into a mask of cold calculation. The thrall was not removed. She had simply been moved to a new, more strategic position on the board. She was no longer a contender for the crown, but she was now the most important piece in the game for the future of the kingdom. And that, perhaps, made her an even more necessary target for removal. A gift was delivered to Alara's new, richer chambers later that night. It was a small, ornate wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a silver brooch in the shape of a hawk. It was a beautiful, noble gift. But as Alara lifted it, she felt a sharp prick on her finger. Tucked beneath the velvet lining, almost invisible, was a single long thorn from a poisonous plant. It was not a welcome. It was not a gift. It was a message, delivered in the language of the court she was now a part of. A clear, silent warning. You may have the Jarl's protection, But you are not safe here. Your new life has begun, and it is surrounded by enemies. Ilara looked from the box to the heavy wooden door of her new room. She was no longer a slave, but she was less free than ever before. She was the keeper of the Heir's voice, a title that felt more like a target painted on her back. She had wanted only to help a lonely, broken child. Instead, she had stumbled into the heart of a vicious struggle for power. She thought of the thorn, so small yet so deadly, a perfect symbol of her new reality. The quiet girl who moved through the shadows was gone. In her place was a figure of consequence, a person who would have to learn to navigate a world of hidden poisons and smiling threats if she wanted to survive. From his high seat, Bjorn watched the last of his council depart, their faces a mixture of grudging acceptance and simmering resentment. His compromise had pleased no one, but it had, for now, prevented open rebellion. He had bent his oath without breaking it, a piece of political maneuvering that left a sour taste in his mouth. He felt like a man who had tried to dam a river with his bare hands. He had diverted the flood for a moment, but the pressure was building, the water was rising, and he knew, with the grim certainty of a seasoned warrior, that the dam was not going to hold for long. He had bought himself time, but he had also made Ilara the single point of failure for his entire kingdom. That night, Leif did not sleep in his own bed. He was moved to a small cot in Ilara's new chambers, a decision Bjorn had made without consulting anyone. When the boy was brought to her, he walked straight to her side and took her hand, his small fingers wrapping around hers with a desperate strength. He did not speak, but his eyes, fixed on her face, were full of a silent, pleading relief. The immediate crisis was over. The boy was with his anchor. But as Ilara looked down at him, she felt the immense weight of her new title. She was his keeper, his shield. And in this hall of wolves, she was armed with nothing but a shared memory of pain. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, deceptive glow over the room. Leif finally drifted to sleep, his breathing soft, and even for the first time in days. Ilara sat in a chair beside him, watching the rise and fall of his small chest. She was not a noble. She was not a politician. She was a fisherman's daughter who had survived a nightmare. She had no skill with words of statecraft or the subtle dance of power, but she understood the landscape of fear. She knew the geography of a shattered mind. That, she realized, was her only weapon. In this court of warriors and schemers, her greatest strength was not a hidden dagger, but her own broken past. Lady Astrid stood on a balcony, overlooking the sleeping keep. The Jarl's decision was an insult, a clever trick that solved nothing. He had elevated a nobody, given her influence over the future Jarl. The girl was a weed that needed to be pulled before she took root. Astrid's ambition was not a fleeting desire. It was a cold, patient fire that had burned for years. She had seen the Jarl's grief as an opportunity, a crack in the foundation of his power. This thrall was now the key. If the girl were to fail, if some tragic accident were to befall the boy while under her care, the Jarl's authority would crumble completely, and she would be there to pick up the pieces. In the barracks, Gorm the Berserker slammed his drinking horn down on the table, sloshing ale everywhere. "Keeper of the Heir's voice?" he roared to the men around him. "She's a foreign witch who has addled the Jarl's mind." He saw this not as a political maneuver, but as black magic. The boy had been cursed, and this thrall had not broken the curse, but merely twisted it to her own advantage. He was a man of action, of simple, brutal solutions. He believed that the sickness in the Jarl's court needed a blade to cure it. His loyalty was to the idea of a strong Jarl, and in his eyes, Bjorn was no longer that man. His loyalty was beginning to waver. Ilara gently retrieved the small wooden bird from Leif's sleeping grasp. She held it in her palm, its familiar weight, a small comfort in the vast uncertainty of her new life. She looked at the boy, then at the door, beyond which lay a world of threats she could barely comprehend. She had stepped out of the shadows to offer a hand to a drowning child, and now she found herself pulled into the same deadly current. Her fear was a cold, sharp thing, but as she looked at Leif's peaceful face, a new feeling began to crystallize alongside it, a fierce, protective resolve. They had both survived the raiders. Now they would have to find a way to survive the court. Bjorn stood by his son's old, empty bed, the carved wolf toy still lying where he'd left it. He had made his move. He had created a new position, a new reality in his hall. But it was a fragile construction, built on a thrall's empathy and a boy's trauma. He had named her the Keeper, but he knew the truth. He was the one who had to keep them both safe now. He had faced down armies and sea monsters, but this new enemy was a whisper in the halls, a poison in a cup, a hidden thorn. This was a battle that could not be won with an axe, and for the first time in his life, the Iron Bear was not sure if he was strong enough to win. As the first light of dawn touched the top of the keep, Elara was still awake. She had not slept. She had spent the night watching Leaf, listening to the sounds of the guards outside her door, and thinking. She was a piece on a board, she knew that. But even a pawn, if it can reach the other side, can become a queen. She had no desire for that kind of power. Her goal was simpler, and far more difficult. She had to guide this broken boy all the way across the board, through a field of enemies, to a place of safety. Her own survival was secondary. Her new life had a single, all-consuming purpose, to be the shield for the Silent Prince. Lady Astrid sent a servant to Elara's room with a morning meal and a message. The message was simple, an invitation to walk in the gardens later that day. It was an offer of friendship, a gesture of peace from the highest-ranking woman in the court. Elara knew it was nothing of the sort. It was a summons. It was the next move in the game. She looked at the servant, a young girl not much older than she had been when she was taken, and saw the fear in her eyes. "Tell the Lady Astrid I would be honored," Elara said, her voice steady. The game had begun, and she had no choice but to play. Bjorn called his captain of the guard, a grizzled old warrior named Hakon, whose loyalty was beyond question. "You will watch her," Bjorn commanded, his voice low. "You will watch the boy. But most of all, you will watch my court. Watch Astrid. Watch Gorm. Watch them all." He was placing spies on his own people, a move he would have once considered dishonorable, a sign of a weak tyrant. But his kingdom was no longer threatened by outside forces. The greatest danger was now within his own walls, festering in the hearts of the very people he had sworn to lead. The Hall of the Iron Bear had become a nest of vipers, and he did not know where the next strike would come from. The garden was a place of deceptive peace, a small square of green and stone tucked within the keep's gray walls. Lady Astrid walked the path with a practiced grace, her fine wool cloak brushing against the late-blooming heather. Elara followed a half-step behind, her new, simple dress feeling foreign and stiff. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the distant forest and salt from the sea. It was a beautiful day, but Elara felt no warmth. She was acutely aware of the guards posted at the garden entrance, and the hawk-like gaze of Astrid, who had led her to a stone bench overlooking a steep drop to the rocks below. The invitation was a pretense, and the real conversation was about to begin, a battle to be fought with words as sharp as any blade. "It is a remarkable thing you have done," Astrid began, her voice smooth as polished stone, though her eyes remained cold. She gestured vaguely towards the keep. "To give the Jarl back his heir's voice. A miracle, some are calling it. Others." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Call it witchcraft." She turned to face Elara, her smile a thin, bloodless line. "You must be very clever. To come from nothing, a thrall taken in a raid, and find yourself in such a position. The keeper of the heir's voice. A title of convenience. Tell me, what is it you truly want? Gold? A ship to take you home? Name your price. Every clever thing has a price." Elara met the noblewoman's gaze, her heart a steady, slow drum. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was an old, familiar companion. It no longer ruled her. "I have no home to return to," she said, her voice quiet but firm, refusing to be baited by the insult. "And I want no gold. My title is the Jarl's word, not my own. My only concern is for Leif. He has been through a storm. I am simply trying to help him find the shore." She did not raise her voice or betray any anger. She simply stated her truth, a small, solid rock against which Astrid's manipulative waves could crash. Her simplicity was a weapon Astrid did not understand. Astrid let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like chipping ice. "How noble! You would have us believe this is all for the boy, a selfless act of pity." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me tell you how this world works, little thrall. Power is not given. It is taken. It belongs to those with the blood and the strength to hold it. You have neither. You are a temporary amusement, a tool the Jarl is using to soothe his grief. But tools break. And when you do, the boy will be alone again, and the Jarl will need a true partner, a woman of a proper house, to secure his legacy. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a promise. Ilara did not flinch. She simply looked past Astrid, towards the high tower where she knew Leif's window was. "Leif does not need a queen," she said softly, her words aimed more at herself than at the fuming noblewoman. "He needs to know he is not alone in the dark. That is all I have offered him. That is all I will continue to offer him." She turned her gaze back to Astrid, and for the first time, the noblewoman saw something in the thrall's eyes that wasn't fear. It was a profound, unyielding certainty, an authority that came not from a title or a bloodline, but from a shared, deep understanding of pain. It was a power Astrid could not touch, and therefore one she had to destroy. The following days were a quiet war. Meals arrived for Ilara and Leif that she would not let him touch until she had tasted them first. A loose floorboard appeared at the top of a steep staircase, which she discovered only by testing every step before allowing Leif to pass. She was a shadow at the boy's side, her senses honed by a lifetime of servitude and survival. She saw threats everywhere, in the lingering stare of a huskarl, in the overly sweet smile of a serving girl, in the sudden convenient absence of guards in a secluded corridor. She was not just a keeper, she was a bodyguard, defending the boy not from an open attack, but from 1,000 deadly accidents waiting to happen. Leif, for his part, began to change. With Ilara as his constant, unwavering shield, the world began to seem less terrifying. He spoke more, though his words were still hesitant whispers, fragile as birds' eggs. He would name things he saw: cloud, dog, sword, and looked to Ilara for confirmation, his small hand often clutching hers. He even began to carve his own small wooden animal, a lopsided wolf, his brow furrowed in concentration. The fortress of silence was being dismantled stone by stone, replaced by a small, safe world built for two, existing precariously in the heart of a hostile keep. Each new word he spoke was a victory for them, and a growing insult to those who wished them gone. The inevitable escalation came during the midday meal in the great hall. Bjorn had insisted they eat with the court, a move to normalize their presence. Gorm, the hulking berserker, was telling a loud, boisterous story, swinging his arms wildly. As he accidentally stumbled backward, his massive form was on a direct collision course with Leif's small chair. It was too fast for anyone to react, a perfect, tragic accident in the making. But Ilara, who had been watching Gorm's feet and not his face, moved like a flash. She didn't scream or shout. She simply threw her body between the berserker and the boy, taking the full, crushing impact herself. She was thrown to the floor, the air driven from her lungs in a painful gasp. Leif let out a cry, a genuine, piercing sound of fear and anger, the loudest noise he had made in over a year. "No!" he screamed, the word a thunderclap in the suddenly silent hall. Bjorn was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of black fury, his sword half drawn from its scabbard. Gorm stood over Ilara, his face a caricature of drunken surprise, but his eyes, for a split second, flickered towards Lady Astrid, a fatal, telling glance. Hakon, the captain of the guard, saw it. Bjorn saw it. The plot, clumsy and brutal, was laid bare for all to see. Bjorn's voice cut through the stunned silence, a low, dangerous rumble that promised violence. "To the high seat! All of you!" he commanded, his eyes locking onto Gorm and then sweeping to find Astrid, who had gone pale. "The time for whispers and games is over." He strode to where Ilara was struggling to her feet, helped by two of Hakon's loyal men. He looked at her, then at his son, who was now clinging to her, his face buried in her tunic. The Jarl's face was grim, etched with the terrible certainty of what he had to do. He had tried to divert the river of his court's ambition, but it had broken the dam. Now he would drown the conspirators in its flood. The great hall felt like a tomb, the air thick with fear and anticipation. Bjorn stood before his throne, not sitting upon it, choosing to be a judge on the floor with his people. Gorm and Lady Astrid were brought before him, flanked by guards. "I made an oath," Bjorn began, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "An oath of a desperate father. I offered a throne for a word. But I was a fool. I offered the wrong prize. The prize was not power. It was my son's return from the darkness. A prize Alara won not for ambition, but because she understood his pain. A lesson some of you still have not learned. His gaze was like iron, pinning them in place. He turned to Gorm. You are a warrior of this house. You swore an oath of loyalty to me and my line. Today you used your strength, not to defend my son, but to harm him, and to harm the one person who has been his shield. You have broken your oath. You are no longer a man of this hall. He then looked at Lady Astrid, his expression filled with a cold contempt. And you speak of bloodlines and tradition, yet you conspired to murder a child to further your own ambition. There is no honor in your blood, only poison. His judgment was swift and absolute, a chilling display of the power he had held in reserve. You will be stripped of your titles and lands, he declared to Astrid. You will be exiled, sent back to your brother's hall in shame. Gorm, for your treason, you will be given the same choice you sought to give my son. A swift death by the axe, or a long one in the wilderness beyond our borders, banished and alone. The sentences were devastating, a complete political and social annihilation. He was cutting the infection out of his court, no matter how deep it went. He was choosing his son and the thrall who saved him over the traditions and allies who had sought to destroy them. It was a terrifying, revolutionary act. As the guards led the condemned away, a new quiet settled over the hall. It was the silence of a world remade. Then Leif, still holding Alara's hand, looked up at his father. His voice was small but clear in the vast room. She stays, he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. It was the voice of a future Jarl, making his first command. Bjorn looked down at his son, and for the first time he saw not just a broken child, but the seed of the leader he would one day become. A leader forged not just in strength, but in the fires of loss and the healing power of empathy. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself in the keep. The whispers did not vanish entirely, but they were muted, driven into the deepest shadows by the Jarl's decisive action. Alara's title was no longer a matter of debate. It was a pillar of the new court. She sat in council with Bjorn, not to speak of war or trade, but of the people, of the families, of the quiet wounds that festered in a community built for hardness and battle. She taught him a new language of leadership, one that listened more than it commanded, and he, in turn, taught her the ways of his world, trusting her judgment and her unique, quiet strength. Alara never wore the fine gowns of a noblewoman again. She chose simple, practical clothes, a quiet refusal of the station others tried to force upon her. Her power did not come from silks or silver, but from her bond with Leif and the Jarl's trust. She walked the halls not as a thrall or a lady, but as herself. The girl who had been invisible was now seen by everyone. She was no longer a piece in their game. She was a player who had changed the rules, proving that the deepest strength was not in a name or a title, but in the courage to care for another's broken heart. Bjorn found himself changing in ways he never thought possible. He still led the hunts and oversaw the training of his warriors, his voice still a roar that could make men tremble. But he also spent time simply sitting with his son, listening as Leif told him about his day, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing week. He learned to see the world through Leif's eyes, a world where strength was not just about swinging an axe, but about having the courage to speak a painful truth, to trust another person, to admit you need help. He was still the Iron Bear, but his iron had been reforged, tempered with a father's love. Leif's laughter, when it finally returned, was not a loud, booming thing like his father's. It was a quiet, gentle sound, heard first in the gardens as he watched a clumsy puppy chase its tail. The sound was a miracle, more precious to Bjorn than any treasure or conquest. The boy still had nightmares sometimes, but they were fewer and farther between. When they came, Alara would be there, not to chase the shadows away with false promises, but to sit with him in the dark, until the dawn came, her quiet presence a constant reminder that he was no longer alone. The silent fortress was gone, replaced by a home. One crisp autumn morning, Alara and Leif stood on the high battlements, looking out over the fjord. The sea was calm, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Leif held the lopsided wooden wolf he had carved, while Alara clutched the small seagull her father had made for her so long ago. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the gulls circle and dive in the distance. They were two survivors of the same storm, their shared past no longer a prison but the bedrock of their unlikely family. They had found their safe harbor not in a place, but in each other. From across the courtyard, Jarl Bjorn watched them, his great arms resting on the stone parapet. A real seagull swooped low over the keep, and he saw Leaf point, his voice carrying clearly on the wind. "Gull," the boy said, a simple observation, a statement of fact. He then looked at the wooden bird in Alara's hand, and then back at the sky, a small smile touching his lips. Bjorn smiled too, a true, deep smile that reached his eyes. He had made a promise to share his throne. He had kept it, not by giving away a seat of power, but by making room in his world for a new kind of strength, a new kind of honor, a new future for his son and for his people.